A very warm welcome to all of you at whatever time it is in your part of the world. And we hope to have a good discussion on an excellent paper which Fred Jenny had published and which we had even circulated on our fora for people to comment about, looking at the of economy in, I would say. And it is something which is most unprecedented. I don't think anybody can remember anything as bad as this. And in India, the latest data shows that it is only worsening in terms of the COVID-19. And the Indian economy itself was in a bad shape before COVID-19 hit us. So what it has done is only taken us down further. On the contrary, if you look at the US economy, which is very surprising, it seems to be doing well in the sense that the unemployment is very low. So there are issues which one understands very little. And what is it that we would need to do in order to advise governments, including competition agencies, to deal with this kind of situation in times to come? I remember the week I was in a panel where I said that competition agencies will have to understand the need for economic resilience, particularly in economies which are not doing too well. And how are they going to then, face the future? You cannot be applying the stick, or you cannot be applying the law in a very sort of ununderstanding way. It has to be done in a way that will help us. So what we've been able to do is to, other than the paper which Fred wrote about and the discussion that we had so far on the fora, some of the participants are here who had participated in that debate: Eleanor, Taimoon, Grant Murray, etc. And we hope that how we can take it forward. So may I now turn over the microphone to Fred to please make his presentation as short as possible, because we have really limited time for people to respond. And we've already sent you out the note as to what is it that we are looking at. And I'm sure, most of you would probably find it difficult to express your views within 5 minutes, but if you can do it, I still remember at one of the fora, what was pointed out by the moderator to me was, can you start with your conclusions? And if you then have to expand them within the time limit, then you can do that. So over to you, Fred.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a little bit more than 5 minutes, but I'm going to start.
You have more than 5 minutes. Fred, you have more than 5. You have 10 minutes.
Well, I was given 15 minutes by your son, so I'll keep the 15 minutes. But in any case, I'm going to start with a conclusion in a sense. And one of the conclusions is that a distinctive feature of this situation is the fact that because of the suddenness, the speed, and the scope at which the pandemic grew, we were left with an economic situation where there was misadjustment or lack of adjustment between supply and demand on the number of markets. And not only that, but waiting for the adjustment, as we are used to do when we think about competition, that eventually the price mechanism is going to bring up supply to the level of demand or bring down demand to the level of supply. This mechanism couldn't work because it was generating a huge externality in terms of expanding the pandemic, and therefore killing people. So all of a sudden we're faced with massive market failures that justified to a large extent the Fed had to intervene, and competition parties had to look at things a bit differently, which they did by allowing, for example, cooperation among companies, for example, to speed up the production of vaccine, or in many of the markets, particularly in Australia, and there were a number of markets that were taken off the competition, the ambit of the competition law, to try to facilitate the adjustment between supply and demand. So there were all kinds of little adjustments of that type. All of a sudden, some of the mergers, which looked like they were anti-competitive, became seen in a completely different light because the macroeconomic environment had changed massively. Okay, so that's the general picture. Now, in the paper, I talk about a number of trade-offs, and this paper was written at the very beginning of the pandemic, or in early March, but those have stayed to a large extent. One of the trade-offs that I talk about is the trade-off between science and politics, and I think that we've seen plenty of developments there in many countries where discredited politicians try to hide behind scientists, but that creates a double ambiguity. First of all, what is the role of scientists? Is it to make decisions? And second, and there we have tensions that we've seen in France, that we've seen in Sweden, that we've seen in the US, when the scientists don't say exactly what the politicians want, or when the politicians want to hide behind the scientists. So there's a question of legitimacy of policy decisions. On the human rights response to health crisis, and I'm going to be very short, I mean, the countries that, in a sense, have mastered the COVID-19 pandemic the best are Taiwan and Hong Kong and China, which are places where you had a combination of one, very disciplined people, but also massive government interventions to track people, to enforce lockdowns, things that would not have been or were not acceptable in other parts of the world. I mean, before we started, we were just talking with Rob Anderson about the fact that in Florida, for example, the atmosphere is quite different. So the efficiency of the response was based on the fact of acting fast and acting strongly. And acting strongly, there could be a trade-off between human rights on the one health and efficiency of the answer to the health crisis. On the scientific method versus precautionary principle, there is a one story which went through the US to many countries in the world, which is the story of the hydroxychloroquine, where this dilemma was clear. It was clear that we did not have the scientific study following the scientific methodology that was needed to ensure that this medicine was useful. At the same time, there was no time because, as I said, because of the market failure, the pandemic will really apply in a case like this. Should you wait until you have perfect scientific results, or should you act even before on the basis of precautionary principles? And we've heard debates about this, so I'm not going to go into this. The phase, the economic cost of the lockdown, really, or the answer to the pandemic, versus the human cost. So there's been a debate in the US, in Europe. For example, the chancellor of in Germany, the head of the Bundestag, has said the cost of the lockdown is too much compared to the cost of the pandemics, and therefore we should not follow the advice of the scientists on this. And so there's been a very interesting debate there on whether we should save lives or whether we should save money, which I think personally is a false debate, because there are some really interesting studies that came, for example, from Australia, and which shows that in economic terms, the cost of the pandemics was much higher than the total cost that we had to of the lockdown. For example, in the case of Australia, roughly the estimate is that if there had been a herd immunity, which is the counterfactual, there would have been something like 225,000 deaths. And if you value the death at roughly 2 million Australian dollars, then the cost of this in itself is already $1 trillion Australian dollars, whereas the cost of the lockdown was about 20% of the GDP, and or 15% of the GDP was about $180 billion, Australian dollars. But in any case, this issue was very much debated, sometimes without having the good figures that that should have helped the discussion. But there was this issue of whether there was a trade-off between the two. Globalization, national sovereignty. So this question had already been on the table for a while because of what some perceived to be the unfairness of the global trade, because all the rules are not, the domestic rules are not the same in all the countries. But what came on top of this unfairness feeling came the idea that in a situation like the pandemic, we've lost our national sovereignty. And why have we lost our national sovereignty? Well, in the case of Europe, for example, it's very interesting to see that the pharmaceutical industry has changed in Europe considerably over the last 20 years. Now it's only interested in terms of research and development, finding new medicine, and then marketing. And everything which is the production of active substance has been delegated to other countries and distant countries, but has been delocalized from Europe. And the result, of course, is that when there's all of a sudden a huge spike in demand, they may not be enough to go, to sustain the demand because the countries where the product is being produced themselves are under lockdown. So all of a sudden, there is this idea that globalization, on top of being unfair, also leads to a loss of national sovereignty. I personally don't agree with this because I think that the issue is not really globalization in this case. The issue is more the lack of diversification of the sources of supply rather than the fact that the sources of supply are elsewhere. If you put all your sources of supply in one particular country and this country goes under lockdown, then of course you're going to be very dependent. But this is not an issue which is linked directly to globalization. So this discussion still goes on and of course leads to a related issue, which is the desire to, or revival rather, of industrial policy considerations. We have to bring back what we delocalized to some extent. This is much talk, and I don't think that there's going to be much action, at least if I go by the past. Relocalization have always been extremely minimal, but it has fostered, particularly in Europe, but I think not only in Europe, also in other countries, a revival of the discussion on two aspects of industrial policy: the proactive aspect of industrial policy. We have to promote strategic industries. And second, the defensive industrial policy. We have to protect our strategic industries from the possibility that using the crisis, some foreign firms or foreign governments will try to hijack our strategic technologies. So there are ideas there about changing the unfairness. So that's, for example, the EU white paper, which has come out yesterday, which is, well, we want to look at whether those foreign firms that have ideas about buying European firms, are they supported by state subsidies that make competition unequal, and shouldn't we be able to block those mergers when they come from heavily subsidized firms? Okay. And second, there is a revival of ideas about reinforcing foreign investment control in order to prevent hostile takeover of strategic industries. Now, there's a great story in Germany with CureVac. The US, CureVac is a company that is working on the vaccine for COVID-19. Apparently, President Trump and Vice President Pence offered $1 billion to buy it. It created a huge emotion in Germany. And this week, the German government has said that it's going to invest $300 million to get 23% of the capital to make sure that the company is not taken over by the US, which would deprive the Europeans of the well-deserved medicine. Finally, and I'm finishing on this, the whole issue of privatization, digitalization, and public health. One of the things which is quite striking is the fact that the new technologies, the digital technologies, and artificial intelligence can be extremely useful in all aspects of this crisis, whether it's to fight misinformation or whether it's to find drugs, where artificial intelligence is very useful to understand the structure of viral proteins, to increase transparency and traceability, to track people, to facilitate risk assessments, to facilitate remote working, or to use facial recognition as an additional way to prevent contacts between people and to allow them to have an intercourse without necessarily directly shaking hands or running a risk. You see this, and one of the consequences of this is that all of a sudden, policymakers have realized that there is a dilemma between wanting to, on the one hand, protect privacy, on the other hand, ensure sovereignty over your own data, and the fact that many of those technologies require huge amount of data and require the pooling of data to be able to work. And as a result, for example, the EU has been changing its position. I mean, right now there is a consultation on artificial intelligence, but where it wanted to stop the use of artificial intelligence, it has changed its views because it needs now to use it to try to solve this crisis. So this is a new and I think fairly important development. Okay, I'm stopping here.
Thank you, Fred. And let me also welcome Nadeem Haq from Pakistan. You joined late, Nadeem. Nadeem?
I thought it was 5 o'clock Indian time, so I joined at 5, but I guess I was a little late. Go ahead.
No, 5:30 Indian, 5 o'clock Pakistan time.
Yeah, 5:30 Indian time, 5 o'clock Pakistan. That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Anyway, welcome. I hope you've been able to catch some of what Fred spoke about. And we are now going to turn to Dr. Mayram Arvind. Over to you. 5 minutes, please.
So that, am I worried or am I?
Some very interesting question, which I thought you were perfectly situated to respond in terms of the industrial policy approach of governments in this kind of situation.
See, one big question that is coming up now repeatedly and increasingly is this the end of globalization? And because of this protectionism, which has started with the US and then it has moved on to other countries, and in India now we have this major challenge because of the entire movement for the boycott of Chinese goods and so on. There is this whole issue now which is at the table, and also this second question whether multilateralism has any role to play in the post-COVID world. I think one factor which is really bothering people is that the disruption of supply lines which has taken place because of the COVID, the global supply lines, has created a huge vacuum in many countries, including in India, in terms of the import of intermediates or import of raw materials and so on. And therefore, there is a kind of a realization that if similar kind of pandemics, which are now being predicted will hit the globe more often. Uh, would it not be more, for resilience purposes, will it not be important to become inward looking and possibly protect the domestic industry, make it grow, so that we don't run into another disruption of this nature, where mostly the countries which are importing countries like the emerging market economies or the developing countries, they get into a more difficult situation than the other countries. So the jury is still out. We don't know how it will go forward, but we certainly are seeing that there is this growing clamor in the policy circles to begin to look at how to protect one's own domestic industry and domestic turf uh, in the light of what we have seen in the case of pandemic. One other thing which I think is going to be important is in terms of the volatility of finance, which I think very few people are looking at. But for a long period, because of globalization and because of integration of a lot of financial systems, capital had begun to move, rapidly from one country to the other, mostly from the developed world, especially after 2008, when the stimulus happened. A lot of money came into the emerging market economies, and then it has now suddenly gone back and is still going back because of the uncertainty. Once the doors begin to close, and like in the case of India, we now have already put certain FDI restrictions on the investment coming from countries which share borders with India. Obviously, it is aimed at Chinese investments into the country. But this is something where we will see also disruption of financial flows, possible disruption of financial flows, and how the new global financial architecture emerges is also yet not very clear. So I'll stop there and we'll take any questions.
Brilliant, brilliant, Arvind. That was excellent. Fred, he referred to this point about the kind of takeover issue which Government of India brought in mainly against Chinese investment. But this is before the kind of conflict we are having with China today and the kind of boycott that we're talking about. The other point which Arvind made, Fred, is answers the question that you had raised. Suddenly the Government of India has launched a self-reliance mantra. That look, and that is something which is worrisome, as you pointed out yourself. Now, may I request Nadeem Haq?
Yeah, sure. Look,
5 minutes, sir.
Sure, no problem. Okay, from my point of view, I think our biggest problem, we did a webinar on competition yesterday, and we've done quite a few on our growth and from our point of view, globalization. The way we look at it in Pakistan, quite frankly, is that our problem is not what do I call it, so much competition policy, because we've got a competition commission which has been around for the last 15 years and quite frankly has not been able to perform, nor has it been able to do much. Our problem is really deregulation. And we've kind of put the cart before the horse. We are trying to do competition policy without deregulation. So we've got no markets, and yet we are doing competition policy. We've got a license Raj in place. We've got these exemptions on industry in place. We've got an industrial policy that's based on heavy protection and heavy subsidies. So when you've got a huge sort of industrial policy as well as agricultural market, the government intervenes. So the government is the 900-pound gorilla in every market. And quite frankly, the government doesn't let any market work. We've done an estimation of the footprint of the government, and the footprint of the government happens to be about 70 to 80% of the market. It's almost in every market, either directly intervening or doing price controls or giving exemptions to people or creating entry barriers or creating legal barriers. Now, in that kind of environment, the markets don't work really. And people are trying to adjudicate competition, and we've got all kinds of competition laws and things in place. But our biggest problem right now is for the next, I guess, 20 years, not even less, maybe even 30 years, is extreme deregulation first getting the market to work. And then we'll worry about competition policy because, quite frankly, right now, I'll tell you, we've got an inquiry commission on the sugar market. And it's turned out the sugar market is heavily, heavily rigged. For example, the British put in laws, and I guess you have the same, that there could be only one sugar mill in every area. So there's kind of plantation is monopolized. We've got a thing on power sector. Again, we see monopolies everywhere, but they're not monopolies. They're government mandated monopolies and government guaranteed monopolies. The wheat market, the government still buys wheat thanks to the Second World War, but we haven't figured out that Second World War is over. We're still buying wheat all over the place. And the government is storing wheat, doing it effectively, creating a contingent liability on the budget for about 200 billion rupees, which is continuing to be rolled over, but at some point the day of reckoning will come. So I can go through, we've got automobile markets heavily protected, which again, don't seem to have any competition at all. They've rigged up prices more than the devaluation over the last a few years, and there's no check on them. We've got the fertilizer market, again, is running on contracts on provision of natural gas at a huge subsidy. So quite frankly, I think rather than worry about globalization, other things, I'm more worried about our deregulation. If that doesn't happen, we are just, all I'm thinking, I think we've also created a lawyer Raj now. There's so much law on competition, on all these things. My lawyer friends are raking it in. They've got Porsches, they've got lovely cars, they've got lovely houses, because they are raking it in with all this law. So honestly, all we are doing is increasing the law. So help me out, tell me what we should do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. But the fact is that I wish maybe if you can come back later on in terms of the kind of situation which is evolving and how would Pakistan face it, not only in terms of the kind of industrial structure that you have, but as it stands as to how it will face the kind of situation which is emerging in terms of the, there'll be contraction of the export markets, undoubtedly. This is bound to happen, not only because of supply chains, but increasing lack of consumption, I would say.
If you like, I can answer that now. The problem is, we have also been following what I call a mercantilist policy. Because
Right.
frankly, we have been stuck in the development economics of the 1960s. I don't think we revised the development economics of the 60s. We are still, I keep writing about it, we are still pursuing a planning model. We still have 5-year plans. We are still looking to export, and we are still subsidizing our exports. For example, all our exports are subsidized. So we are subsidizing Walmart, we are subsidizing the American consumer. And I find that very strange, and I call that the new mercantilism, right? I don't see why, and I've been arguing this for the 20 years, you've got a 220 million market that the Chinese are filling up. Why aren't we producing for our own market? We've got shalwar kurtas coming from China. We've got these prayer mats coming from China. So why can't we make it for ourselves? So I think maybe this is an opportunity where our people will discover the domestic market rather than make T-shirts for Walmart for $1 premium, which I find is absolutely useless. You'll be doing $1 manufacturing for Walmart. Why can't we look at our own market? We've got now growing middle class. We estimated the TID are growing. Our middle class may be as much as 70 million, not as large as India, but still.
I think we should have a bilateral conversation on
Please do, please.
They're very similar to India. May I now invite Taimoon? Taimoon, over to you.
Right, thank you, Pradeep. So I want to raise 2 or 3 issues. And the first thing is, Fred pointed to the fact that in countries like South Korea, etc., where there is a very strong authoritarian type governments, there have been a lot of compliance and they'll be able to handle the COVID-19 challenge much better. But I have a proposition to make here that there has been a real compliance in the Caribbean in the context of strong democracy. So we have had a population that has been highly engaged and informed and has complied with the sheltered home requirements. Our politicians have deferred to the scientists and followed the WHO instructions and guidelines to the T. And we have actually handled the virus very, very well in the Caribbean. This is not publicized very much, but we've had very few cases. And those of you who know me have heard me talk again and again about the vulnerabilities of small economies, etc., etc. But this is one situation in which being a small island economy was very helpful because we closed our borders. There was no way for anyone to come in. We had a small population, and therefore we were able to track and trace and quarantine cases in a much better way, a much more efficient way than can happen in a large economy with a large population. So the Caribbean has actually emerged out of this in terms of public health very, very well. We have not had an issue or debate about use of technology because we've not been using facial recognition or GPS technology, except in Trinidad, where they did have GPS technology introduced 5 years ago to track malaria cases and spray, targeted spraying. And this was used for tracking and tracing, and there has been no objection to this in Trinidad. However, the choice between public health and the economy, the Caribbean came down very firmly on the side of public health. And there was no disagreement from the public on this. And it's because we are so vulnerable because of the tourism industry. We had the perfect storm case of bringing the virus in. And so they had to close borders. And they're only now opening, even the domestic economy is only now gradually opening up. So very, very strong and severe shelter-in-place requirements. And only 3 Caribbean countries this week has begun to open its borders to tourism with very strong public safety, health requirements for tourists coming in. Tourists must have a certificate saying that they have tested negative in the last 48 hours. And even with that, in one Caribbean country, an American Airlines flight came in and 12 people had to be quarantined instead of having a holiday. So therefore, there is a lot of vulnerability there. And what is the economic cost? Our economies are devastated. In St. Lucia, 78% of the employment is in tourism and tourism-related sectors. We don't have any stimulus packages, or governments don't have the money to do that. We don't have social safety net. And therefore, we have faced a very, very dire situation. And following the 2008 financial crisis, it took 3.5 years for tourism to come back to its former state. And so we're looking for a very long road of recovery. In that context, the last point I would make is that one of the key issues that have come up in the Caribbean is food security, because we rely on foreign exchange, foreign currency, to pay for our food. Something like over 80% of food is imported. But then with the fall in tourism and the fall in government revenues, we also don't have, we have very severe foreign exchange shortages. And Caribbean governments are now talking about a CARICOM approach to food security, with Guyana being the basis because there's a large landmass for producing food for the Caribbean. And in that context, we need industrial policy. There is no way that we can fight against survive the subsidized agricultural products from Europe and the US. But maybe the fact that we wouldn't have the foreign currency to buy it might help us. But I just wanted to point to the fact that our issues are different in the Caribbean. There's been a high level of compliance in the context of strong democracy, and I think a sociologist needs to explain this one. And that our vulnerability, our economic vulnerability, is going to be one that is going to lead to severe economic contraction on a longer term basis in the Caribbean. Thank you. I can't.
Thank you, Tamun. Thank you very much. I think you raised a very important question, which I would like the other panelists also to respond to. That economies which are largely dependent upon tourism are going to be very badly hit as a result of this. You know, what is the way out? I mean, is there some kind of Marshall Plan which could be thought of? And with that, may I now request Bill. Bill, over to you.
I don't think George Marshall is available. And the spirit with which he worked has disappeared. Interesting example. When he went to the Congress in 1947 and 48 to ask for money, he said, it's going to cost a lot. It's going to take a long time. I can't promise you that it will work, but it's worth doing. Do you know a politician anywhere who will speak that way today? Who will underpromise, give a real price tag, give a real timeline, and acknowledge all the doubts? Marshall did. Sadly, I'm not sure where we get that kind of political leadership. But I wanted to point to one area where I would focus attention, certainly if I were a competition agency, but if I were a policymaker too, and that's public procurement. Why is procurement interesting? It's going to be the instrument for lots of these industrial policy measures. It's going to be the conduit through which governments pump countless sums of money, either for emergency aid or for longer term reconstruction. And the way in which that money gets spent can either make things better, a lot better, or make them worse. So it's a vital element of public policy making. In many countries, it's one of the most important instruments for industrial policy. It's how governments fund R&D. It's how they fund the application and implementation of R&D. And as you know, public outlays support vital social services, education, healthcare, transport, come up with a list. At the same time, and this is based on work that I've done with Rob and Alison Jones in the UK, these systems, for the most part, do not perform nearly as well as they might, and quite a few systems are bad beyond belief. So you have a framework into which you're throwing vast amounts of public expenditures, and the return on them is consistently disappointing. I think one thing that a competition agency could do, and I accept that governments are going to be spending a lot of money to diversify supply choices, invest in other capabilities. I think the competition agency can have a lot of useful guidance to provide, assuming that there's a good relationship with these institutions about how to do that. One of the most important bits of advice is, as you spend the money, think about diversification. Do not put it all in one basket. This is your chance to qualify and develop alternative supply sources. And if you sustain that approach over time, even in highly concentrated industries that were thought to be impervious to entry and expansion by new firms, you can make a difference. But it doesn't happen by accident. And that requires a conscious decision. I'll give you a high-tech example that some of you have followed. The distress of the crisis has deflected attention away from it, but in Florida, not so far away from where Rob lives, there was a space launch at the end of last month. 2 human beings sent to the International Space Station on a launch vehicle that was the first to leave the United States in the last decade. That vehicle was built by a company called SpaceX, which was not created until 2002. And SpaceX depended vitally on the willingness of NASA in the middle part of the aughts to encourage its development by giving it contracts for launches and by giving it funds for research and development. So SpaceX goes from a company that had launched nothing in 2002 to really being the lead US producer of launch vehicles and launch services today. 2/3 of all the satellites launched in the United States in the past 12 months have been on SpaceX rockets. And the manned spaceflight program, again, was part of a conscious program by NASA to encourage entry and expansion, which has not only included SpaceX, but included Blue Origin, that's Jeff Bezos' hobby, and 2 other smaller firms that have grown. If NASA and the Department of Defense had done nothing but just pour the money into the single firm provider, which was Lockheed Martin Boeing, a joint venture, this wouldn't have happened. It took a strategic decision to deliberately encourage entry. It was risky, it was expensive, it's taken a long time, and it's worked. I think there are a number of areas, maybe less dramatic, where that can be replicated. But it requires partly the insights that competition authorities have developed over time. It requires the cooperative relationship with government agencies that are making these decisions, these multi-billion-dollar decisions, and it requires the willingness of government agencies to be entrepreneurial and to experiment. NASA took big risks with this program. To go with a largely commercialized program subject to government oversight, that was risky, but arguably a consequence of being in a desperate situation is that you are willing to experiment with things that were thought to be unthinkable earlier. So if I were focusing on one area that could be a vehicle for good industrial policy, more pro-competitive outcomes, and oh yes, if we're talking about equity concerns and wealth distribution, there are few things that governments do to affect the well-being of the dispossessed and the way in which they spend public money on public procurement. That would be a major focal point of what I do to respond to these concerns.
Thank you very much, Bill. That was excellent. Indeed, that is an area which I'm sure Rob will speak about. That's been something which he's worked on for many years. Now, may I invite Raiko, please? Raiko.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to, first of all, thank you for this opportunity to join a very distinguished roundtable. And I also need to remind you that I'm speaking in an individual capacity, not as a commissioner at JFTC. And these are purely my personal views, and I really appreciate the opportunity to say something. First of all, I'd like to make a couple of comments regarding Fred Denny's thesis, and it's going to be influenced by the Japanese experience, which is not this crisis, but the Great East Japan earthquake of 2011. And the earthquake and the tsunami that followed the earthquake damaged a very wide area. This included factories that produced the electronic car parts for the global market, and the electricity generators that served Tokyo surrounding its 6 prefectures, which is almost 40% of the population. So the damage had national and global implication on production and supply chain, as the current pandemic is doing. And I'm also able to see the consequence of almost a decade of reconstruction policies, including a lot of public procurement that Bill just mentioned. First, I'd like to start with section 4 and reference to the trade-off between health strategy and economic strategy. And I wonder if they're really trade-offs, in that both are about maintaining well-being of citizens and saving people. I agree that we need to consider both empirical question and ethical question. And economic issues actually have ethical questions also, like how do we compare utility of different people? And we should not confuse saving jobs and saving people. You can guarantee people's income either by providing employment or by providing income itself. And we need to keep this in mind when we save jobs. Efficient firm exits from the market should not be prevented in order to save jobs. And this relates to the globalization and also industrial policy in Fred's paper, which leads to the point I like to stress. Society and economy must change. Pandemic is a very unfortunate event, but we need to overcome by changing, and it is also an opportunity to change. A lot of effort was put into rebuilding lives and businesses after the earthquake. However, some businesses no longer had the demand or the workers that made it viable. Consumption patterns, supply chains had changed, and workers had been reallocated. We already have begun to see this change with COVID-19. Overall goal of industrial policy will be to accommodate necessary changes to post-pandemic society, which probably will be life with COVID-19. And competition is necessary for reconstruction and transition to the post-disaster society by making sure markets are fair and competitive, conditions necessary for adoption of new business models and new technologies. Way of doing things like how public transportation, court, concerts, or restaurants are organized, and how we work is already changing. But because COVID-19 is so new, there are so many unknowns, and we have yet to find out how the disease is transmitted, which planning new way of dining or production line configuration is difficult. Effective treatment and drugs are just beginning to be established. Narrowly targeted industrial policy is going to be very difficult to implement. So ensuring free entry and exit, including the labor market, will be very critical. And I can see a hint of how industrial policy with competition might work from our recent experience with masks. Fred has mentioned how the French experience regarding masks was, which is very similar to that of Japan. And as an economist, price of masks increasing, so-called gauging, is a signal for resources to be moved to mass production. But of course, this is not very popular. And as Fred mentioned, time necessary to adjust production justifies some intervention. And part of slow response to masks was the fact that until now, they were very seasonal. However, once it became clear that public health policy included year-round demand for masks, production started and shortage was gone very quickly. This is a simple illustration of markets functioning, but the public policy making clear the direction the society is going. This is how industrial policy might work with competition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raiko. May I now turn to David Ongolo. David, are you there?
Thank you, Pradeep. Yeah, very excellent paper by Fred. I read it very, very carefully. In my 5 minutes, perhaps I could just focus on 2-3 issues. One, I think just like in a way, what Raiko mentioned, for countries like Kenya, it wasn't really a choice between going for health protection and looking at the economic consequences. We just could not afford to do what countries like the US did in terms of really paying people to stay at home. If you look at what that would have meant for us, for example, just 5% spending on the 5% of GDP for the type of policies and programs that were put on board in a country like the US, there's no way we could have afforded that. So for a country like Kenya, the choice was just to make sure that we contain movement so as to try and reduce the kind of contamination and infection that would have really been there. The other thing I would really like to bring out is that, and in a way a bit touching on what Bill mentioned, public procurement, but from the perspective of this being an opportunity to really look at how our government undertakes its public spending policies, and actually how they do the budgeting. It's very, very, very clear, and I think anecdotally, 30% of most of our countries' public procurement basically is lost in either corruption or really that type of usage. So for me, this tragedy, of course, coming for us on the back of a very, very serious locust invasion, coming on the back of almost immediately flooding in the country, and then now COVID from March, April, I think provides a very, very, very good basis for our government to really relook at, first of all, what is prioritized in terms of spending. Secondly, how and where to cut on waste. So I think it has really been an opportunity to kind of look inside and ask, in terms of our budgetary allocations, what, first of all, the basic social services, starting with the health, have we really been spending optimally? What are the most urgent areas where governments need to spend? Secondly, in terms of relating this to opportunities for, say, industrial policy and how we have been able to react to, for example, immediate need of personal protective equipment. A very, very interesting opportunities that has arisen out of that is that the local textile industry really came up and were very, very, very quick to kind of change the kind of items that they've been making, such that you find a company like Rivertex, which is the main textile, integrated textile mill, within a few months have done so well in terms of meeting the demand of some of these personal protective textiles that they're actually expanding and reviving one of the largest textile mills that collapsed over 30 years ago in the western part of the country. So in a way, that effect of COVID, looking at what the government has been trying to do in terms of promoting local industries, that in a very, very interesting way has been an opportunity for relocating or really looking at some of the sectors that have benefited from this. Looking forward, obviously, the sectors that have been badly hit, just as Taimur mentioned, we have a similar case. Tourism, the whole transport sector has more or less collapsed. We've heard almost every week in the papers you see, hey, 1 or 2 hotel chains saying they've already sent their staff home. They won't be able to open. What can the government do? And now for those kind of institutions, those type of hotels, those types of sectors to really be able to bounce back, in a way, they'll be forced to really look at kind of a new set of way to do business. So in a way, it's also really forcing them. For example, now, the few that have survived are really trying to see how can we increasingly rely on domestic tourists as a main source of income. Of course, they pay in shillings, but at least they'll be able to meet their overheads. So this has really been, as rightly mentioned, a 1 in 100 years phenomenon. But in a way, it's really forcing governments, it's forcing businesses to really relook at how they manage the economy on the part of governments and businesses, how they can quickly change over. Perhaps I'll stop there.
Thank you, David. And with that, may I now request Alan Fells. Alan?
I unmute.
Just a minute, yeah.
This.
Yeah, you're on.
Yeah.
All right, thank
Pick
you.
up on Nadeem Haque's point and competition advocacy. When the history of competition policy comes to be written, the big failure will be in the advocacy area. It's not the application of traditional competition law. The competition agencies have very little influence on possibly the greatest set of restrictions on competition there is, those from government. And there are a number of causes, I've mentioned two. The competition people want to be very independent, very removed from government, and play in their own sandpit. And so their impact is generally quite small. And in our discussions of the problem of government restrictions, we don't dig in deep enough to analyse the deep political causes of it and the kind of political solutions that would be required. Now, on just the general politics surrounding this thing, let me just say a couple of things. We have a health crisis of uncertain future magnitude and duration. It's spilled over to an economic crisis likely to scar us for several years at least, to social tensions, as we're seeing in the USA, but more generally social tensions, particularly about inequality and race, political tensions and a degree of political instability, and global tensions, economic, security related, political. So there's been a kind of cascading effect, and we cannot, when we talk about what competition laws do and where they fit in, ignore the dramatic changes in surrounding environment. We speak of flattening the coronavirus curve, but it's affected many other curves. The unemployment curve, the poverty curve, the inequality curves, stress and depression and mental health curves, maybe the altruism curve. And at the political governance level, the debt curve, the spending curve, the trust curve, the blame curve, the politicization curve. And at the political level, there are changing public attitudes, a downplaying by the public and governments of the ongoing COVID health issues. We started out all thinking we've got a common enemy, but it's starting to move towards a situation of social tensions. We started often, at least in my country, with the idea there was a caring government. Now we're moving to governments that disappoint us. We've got expert-led governance for a while, but it's moving towards politics as useful. So that's the background. And so with the economic, with competition law, it's always been a kind of luxury good. It's something we have when the economy is going well. And the history is that we drop it when there's recessions and depressions. There is a bit of a difference this time in that this time the competition agencies are more deeply entrenched than in the past. The so-called unanticipated consequences of setting up often tokenistic independent competition agencies which have evolved into being quite serious bodies. So maybe they will pull through. But I do think the institutional foundations of all our institutions, including competition law, are really in danger of being seriously shaken up. And we need to remember that the public support for competition law and the actions of the regulators is most often, I believe, not because of the competition results they get, maybe better prices and so on, as we claim. The support is really for institutions that stand up to big business. That's what the public likes. And that also is quite relevant to the forward politics of competition law. The context is we have an economic crisis. What comes first? Jobs. They're going to be, I mean, it's 10, 15% unemployment, probably for several years and slower growth. So the requirement for policy is jobs. That comes first. Competition is a long way back in the queue of priorities, and it may well be sacrificed. It's jobs, recovery, and the restitution, the restoration of industries that are collapsing around us, like airlines and entertainment and hospitality and tourism and all the others. They're going to come first, and I think there is a real threat to how strongly governments will support the application of competition law.
Hello, Alan.
Yes?
Have you finished?
Unless you want more, I've got another hour or two.
Thank you very much. You didn't mention it. There are 2 points which you raised. One is there's this classical choice between lives and livelihoods, which has been bothering many countries, including now. In Kenya, in fact, it is much more easier. I mean, US, for example, it has been a big debate whether you allow the lockdown to continue or not, or whether you allow people to go back to work and so on. In India, it has been also quite a debate, except that there has been a stronger thrust towards protecting lives. And therefore, now that just recently the governments have started feeling that they must open up the economy, and they've done that. Today I'm speaking from my office, and offices have reopened on a skeleton basis since the last 10 days in the state of Rajasthan and in many parts of our country. The second point which you made was, I think, very interesting, Nadine. This is especially for you. In terms of advocacy, which you began with, the Competition Commission of Pakistan during Mirza Khalid's time did an excellent job in terms of policy advocacy by proper reasoning and proper analysis, etc., etc. Over time, the whole function degenerated when the kind of Joseph Wilson, the next chair, did it very well, but subsequently it just degenerated into nothing. And so that, I think, just to answer your point, that advocacy was very strong in Pakistan. In fact, we were proud of the Competition Commission of Pakistan for the kind of policy advocacy which it did. If you see their website, you can see all the kind of good work they did in the past, which would have led to a lot of deregulation. But as you know, I mean, the political economy in Pakistan is much more difficult than even in India in order to ensure that the markets can open. I just wanted to respond to this particular point as Alan raised it. With that, may I now request Eleanor Fox?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay, so, thank you. This is really very exciting. I want to give a few background thoughts, and then I have 3 categories. And my background thoughts are definitely fueled by what all of you who have just presented have said. So for the background thoughts, which are some themes that I will pull into my other 3 categories. I was very taken with a lot in your paper, Frederick, and among other things that, and Alan just said this too, that competition serves us well in good times. And then when we meet these emergencies of scarcity, it's not competition that's going to deliver the necessities of life. And a question, how do we adjust to this? And while I'm on this point, first of all, it requires some industrial policy. It requires answers to those big questions you've asked, Fred, of trade-offs. That requires leadership. It requires governmental leadership that people trust. And we're in this world today where heads of state don't satisfy those elements that cause us to trust the making of decisions, first even for the people of the country, much less the problem of the community of the world. So my second point relates to the community of, this is still my background, relates to the community of the world. And the horror that we become so nationalistic that the countries that are better off are so nationalistic, while other countries, and both Timoon and David spoke about this, there are some very vulnerable countries that depend on the rest of the world, and they realize now they can't depend on us anymore. And one of the themes I want to pursue, I'm sure Rob is going to say more about this, there's still a community of interest in the world. There is still, and I'll put it sort of in low terms, there's still a game that can be played that makes us all better off, even without drawing on the altruism that we ought to have. And I think that we have to play to this hand of what makes us all better off. We need some collaborations. Some reporters have said, what if the United States finds out that China and elsewhere have developed the vaccine for COVID-19 and they're going to satisfy only their own people and not give it to us, US, then maybe US will wake up and understand that there is some cosmopolitanism that is actually good for it. And that's let alone the altruism, because I believe in the altruism, but I don't believe it's easy to move there. And so all of this makes me think of problems of fairness and distribution, which are so anathema to US antitrust thinking, and which I think are sort of in our face right now. I listened to one of the web programs a week or 2 ago in which James Hodge from the South Africa Commission was one of the panelists, and they were talking about the scarcity of masks. They were even talking about governments stepping in to do something to make the necessary masks available. And somebody said, well, in this interim, maybe we should just let the market allocate it. And James said, what do you mean? That means the rich people get all the masks and the poor people die. So I think there's no way out of thinking that fairness and distribution are on the table. Okay, so now I've used up most of my time. The 3 points I wanted to talk about were: 1, antitrust in this new context. Number 2, Frederick's point about we need resilience, we need planning ahead. And number three, really quickly about roles of UNCTAD and OECD. So for the number one of antitrust in context, it might make the antitrust or markets or competition as a religion people humble. We've found that there are exceptions that one must make, and some of the agencies don't like to call it exceptions, and they'll say, well, our law can cover that too. For example, collaborations that actually probably do have long-term oligopolistic effects, but we let them happen, and they should happen. And the question is how they do this, and it's in a way it's about truth in rule of law making. Another point that comes in here, which comes back to my fairness point, is price gouging, a real problem. How can the antitrust people say not our problem? Well, they do say that in the United States. Opportunism, part of it is price gouging. Part of it is the big firms getting together to say we need to do this for the sake of the community in the short term, but agencies have to be able to look through that to see when the firms are really doing something to help the community and provide the necessities at lower price, or whether this is a game. A failing firm also fits into that. All right, so my second is planning ahead and resilience. And Frederick says this in various ways. Long-term thinking, I think it's very important. And just one little point I'll say here is, I remember in 2008 that Alan Greenspan, head of the Fed Reserve in the United States, was posed with the question about what we should have done to prevent this. And he said, well, he didn't say black swan. I'm saying black swan because it fits. He's saying this is a black swan. It comes up once every 100 years. You don't do anything about it. You just deal with it when it comes. So I think there's a real lesson here, and it's against Alan Greenspan. And it is to say Greenspan should have realized we were inviting that 2007, 2008. We were, the investment banking firms and the mortgage lenders were deceptive to the poor people whose houses were surely going to be foreclosed. And so we should think maybe it's not a black swan, maybe it has some white wings, or maybe even if it is a black swan, there's white because there are things we could do to prevent the horrors that are happening. And for example, now, maybe we couldn't have foreseen it, but we surely could have been more resilient. We could have made some choices, even in the enforcement of antitrust, where US let two big firms that make the protective equipment merge. And then we find, oh my goodness, we have a monopoly and the product isn't being supplied. This is about also Bill's point about a little diversity is actually good for competition, and it's good for the looking ahead. On the looking ahead, I would come back to the point of cosmopolitanism. And again, I'm looking forward to Rob, but have we lost the WTO? Have we lost the spirit of seeing how we can work together where it is good for everyone, sharing data where it's necessary for research, for example, having a spirit of there is community and we're all better off. Okay, last point was simply UNCTAD, OECD. There's room for working on this. I think that both OECD and UNCTAD can carry this to a next stage, and a part of this is restoring cosmopolitan thinking. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alina. And I'll hand over the mic to Frederick Jenny. If you would like to respond to some of these interventions made, and then we'll go back into the second round. Fred, over to you.
Yeah, okay. Just a quick comment on some of the things that were said by Bill and then by Eleanor and by others on the relationship between competition policy and industrial policy. Okay, there's been a market failure. We all understand there are limitations that governments will want to intervene for all the reasons which have been mentioned. The question is, so far, and this speaks also to what Alan Fels was saying, competition authorities have said, oh, watch out, competition is really important. Now, I understand why they say that, but I want to bring a point which is the following. You can look at the relationship between competition policy and industrial policy in two ways. One of them is to say that those are antagonistic. On the one side, you have government intervention, picking winners, destroying the incentives. On the other side, you have something which relies on the traditional incentive of competition. This is basically, in fact, what's happened in Europe, where industrial policy was just a word that would not be even pronounced for the last 10 years because it was supposed to be antagonistic to competition policy. There's a second way to look at industrial policy, which is to say that industrial policy is the complement to competition policy. Why? Because competition doesn't tell us enough about the fact that comparative advantage can be changed by government action. Second, it doesn't tell us enough about the dynamic, about the growth. It doesn't tell us anything about growth. It tells us about efficiency, but not about growth of the economy, which is something which is really important on the agenda. And third, it talks a lot about scale economies and all those, but very little about scope economies or about network economies, which are equally important and maybe more important for productivity, for increasing productivity. Now, okay, so there are two ways to look at the relationship between the two. We are, certainly in Europe, I don't want to speak for the other countries, in a situation where competition policy is seen as adversarial to industrial policy, and competition authorities keep on saying, oh, don't go too far, remember competition is important. Now, the people who listen to this say, oh, you're competition policy people, you are opposed to industrial policy, I discount what you say. So for competition authorities to be credible, they first have to point out that there can be complementarity between industrial policy and competition policy and not an opposition. Second, they have to go into a field in which they haven't gone so far, which is what is a pro-competitive industrial policy? How does it work? Okay, so it is not competition policy, it's competition policy plus the industrial policy part. So as long as we have not overcome those two obstacles, first of all, to eliminate the pseudo-antagonism between the two policies, and B, as long as we have not acquired a proactive discourse by saying this is what a proactive pro-competition industrial policy would be, we cannot be heard. And what we say on industrial policy is just something that is discounted by most politicians. So we have to overcome those two things. I think that this is a really important agenda in order to solve some of the problems and to make progress in some of the areas that you have mentioned.
Thank you very much, Fred. Now, may I turn to Nitin Desai? Nitin, over to you.
Let me begin by what Fred Jenny began with, that what we are confronted by is a breakdown of the mechanism by which supply and demand adjust to one another. The greatest single area of breakdown between supply and demand is in healthcare, particularly in a place like India. This is perhaps the most serious breakdown of the normal mechanisms of balancing of supply and demand that we've seen in terms of affordability, in terms of access, in terms of many other things. So I would say that if today I have to talk to somebody involved in competition policy, I think this is an area where we will have to have a closer look. Just as after 2008, when we had the financial crisis, we had a closer look at how the financial systems were being managed and regulated. I think the time has come for us to have a closer look at how health systems are, where competition, etc., is managed in health systems, particularly in countries like India. And this is where I think I would argue that what Fred Jenny just talked about, the sort of, if you like, so-called conflict between competition policy and industrial policy, more accurately between, in this case, active government provision and intervention in healthcare provision versus government simply regulating what the private sector is going to do by way of healthcare. I would say this is clearly an area where, frankly, the bias should be more towards what we would call industrial policy than towards competition policy, certainly in a country like India, where we have seen gross exploitation by private suppliers of healthcare services of the situation that we have seen. The second point I would make to people involved in this is, if I look at the evidence in the world, there are vast differences in the rate of incidence of the disease, the rate of recovery, the rate of fatality. Somebody should sit down and examine how this is correlated with the nature of the healthcare systems which exist in different countries. They do differ. They differ in the universality of healthcare provision. They differ in the degree of inequality of the healthcare provision. The third point I wish to make is, Pradeep, you spoke about correctly in the clash between lives and livelihoods in India. The thing in India is livelihoods denial often means loss of lives. People are now saying that you have deprived poor people of a livelihood which is challenging their capacity to survive and manage. People are now talking in terms of the deaths which could be caused by hunger, by malnutrition, by the fact that you really abandoned migrant laborers who had to move on their own. Look at the numbers who have died in the process of moving. So this is the notion that there's a choice between lives and livelihood is not very correct, because the loss of livelihoods in a country like India means loss of lives also. Do take an integrated view. So my real point I would make is that when you talk of looking at an economic policy in a post-COVID environment, please remember, you will not be able to separate the management of the epidemic from the management of the economy for at least a couple of years. You are still in places like India at a relatively early stage of the pandemic, and you will have to ask questions about the priorities that you should have for public spending and so on. And in that, you will have to recognize that managing the epidemic is going to remain a major challenge, along with managing the economy, at least for a couple of years. And you should try and integrate the two things together. And you must now act in order to start relieving, rehabilitating the people whom you did not take care of at the early stages of the epidemic. People like migrant laborers, people who are self-employed, people who are now virtually starving. So I would say that some of the challenges that are being talked about between managing the economy and managing the epidemic, frankly, in India, are not very relevant, that you really cannot manage the economy without managing the epidemic. So I thought I'd just stress this point and just leave it at that. So there are many interesting points which have been made by others, which I'm sure we will all learn from. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nitin. I think the important point which you made about public health also ties up with public procurement. Because if the government has to run the public health system, then a lot of it has to depend upon how efficient their procurement practices and policies are, which is a big thing. I mean, even in the National Health Service of UK, for example, has had to deal with cartels of pharmaceutical suppliers. A point which Elena made was also mentioned by you in terms of exploitation, price gouging. Elena, again, it's an issue of supply and demand. Any trader would, always takes advantage of the fact is that this is the time when they can make a killing. Things what could sell for 100 rupees was sold for 200 rupees. Even I have bought things because there was, all the supply lines were totally broken down in the sense that nothing was moving. So whatever stocks which people had, they were, exploiting prices on that. With that, may I now request Ahmed Ghunem. Ahmed, are you there? Ahmed?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, just a minute, Ahmed. Let me also welcome Ajay Chibir, who's joined us late. He's also in Washington, D.C. Ajay? I suppose the
I'm sorry, I'm an hour late, and it's kind of the story of my life that I'm always 1 hour late. I thought when I saw Pradeep, your picture, I thought I'd come to the wrong meeting because it looked like the Oracle. But then when I saw Nitin Bhai, I knew I was in the right meeting, so I'm okay now.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
My apologies to all of you.
He does not expect to see Nitin Bhai with the Oracle.
Over to Ahmed.
Yeah,
Ahmed,
thank you. Thank you, Fred, for the insightful paper. And actually, I'll raise more questions adding to what you said, based on what you said. First of all, I think that post-COVID era will be a louder voice for developing countries. There will be no unfettered Washington consensus type of policies, as all of them, at least now, have been questionable, not only from developing countries' perspective, but as well as has been said today, from developed countries' perspective. The second issue that I think will need redesign and rethinking is the role of multilateral organizations. And here I cannot put them all in one basket. We have agencies that lost completely their credibility, including the World Health Organization. That's maybe the only right thing that Trump said. Not only in dealing with the pandemic, but in everything. It showed a great failure, and that's need a rethinking of how those organizations work. And then we have the three Bretton Woods organizations, and I think they will remain, but the role and strategy will be completely different. The third thing that we should, that this crisis showed is the role, and this has not been said, is the role of religion and its relationship with the science. Whoever your God is, but I think a lot of people started to rethink the not necessarily the contradictory role between religion and science, but the complementary role. And finally, the issue that has been mentioned regarding the luxury of complete shutdown or partly shut down, I think it's a matter of we're just in waiting for more contractionary policies to come. And the governments have been postponing the contractionary policies based on how long they can provide, I won't say stimulus packages, but rather rescue packages. And at the beginning, it was a matter of showing off. It was a matter of pleasing the society that the governments are generous. But once they realized that they cannot continue to be that generous, and some of them started already their contractionary policies being adopted at this stage, even though we're talking about losing jobs and so on and so forth, but at least in Egypt, you can smell the signal of adoption of contractionary policies. And this leads to another issue that has not been mentioned today, is the trade-off between societal tensions, if contractionary policies are adopted, and on the other hand, the debt overhang that all the countries, or a majority of countries, will suffer from. Regarding what Fred mentioned, and I'll add to what he said, is the issue of globalization. Is really globalization a matter of that it was a cause of such crisis, or rather it was a matter of being part of, sorry, the host has asked you to start your video, okay? Rather, it has failed to deal with the issue. And I believe that globalization was not part of the problem, but it rather failed to solve the problem. Regarding the politics and its overriding its role, I think politics has been overriding science, has been overriding everything, and it will continue to be the case. And again, this is a matter of a serious issue. And the human rights issues are actually, and the privacy issues are part of the problem. And I believe here the role will be minimized for the sake of politics and the issue. And this has been the case not only with COVID, we've seen this in France, we've seen this in the US. So the human rights issues are being minimized at this stage. I think I can stop here. Yes, the final issue is the industrial policy. And this has been raised a lot. Do we have a really policy space? That's why I'm saying the developing countries' voice will be higher and higher. But what the shape of it, and this is what Fred tackled in his intervention before the second round of comments. Thank you, Pradeep, and thank you all.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. That was excellent. And I think Ahmed has raised an important point which we really nobody touched, in the sense that, the global economy is going to contract. And many countries, for example, we heard Taimoon and David speak about, how their economies are going to get further worse, because they're highly dependent upon tourism, for example. I mean, it's just one example. So the debt overhang is going to be huge. There's already an issue which is being debated among the international lending institution. May I now request Ajay? Ajay, would you like to come? Ajay? Yeah, Ajay Chibir. Yeah, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, about 5 minutes.
Yeah, so thank you. Apologies again for being late. I got my hour off 1 hour wrong. I'm sorry to have also missed the earlier discussion, but just trailing on to it now.
But you read.
The way I look at it is that the world economy was doing well for some, but not so well for others. And a reset was needed in any case. Certainly for us in India, our economy was declining well before the crisis hit. And of course, it's taken a huge hit now. But then if you look at it across Asia or even globally, I think, there were still a lot of vulnerabilities out there which have now been exposed by this global crisis. So the way I look at it, the world needed a reset, not this kind of a reset, but this came from a orthogonal sort of shock. But that reset was badly needed, and now there's an opportunity for that reset, and whether that reset will be taken or not remains to be seen. I think the role of the state, as people have mentioned, in many different dimensions, whether it is in the health dimension. If you look at, for example, health expenditures, I was looking at health expenditures and military expenditures. And for many countries in the world, military expenditures far exceed health expenditures, including in India, of course. I'm talking about public health expenditure. So we have been preparing to fight the wrong battle globally, and I think, and then when you come to things like industrial policy and competition, again, I think there was already a trend towards protectionism that was growing. The WTO was already in tatters, and now, of course, the WHO is also in tatters. That the world was moving in a direction of trade and industrial policy in that direction. And what this COVID will do is probably push it in that direction. What is of interest to me, I've been working with FICCI for the last 3 years, is what the business sector will be doing. And there, I think this whole issue of a business model that was very reliant on just-in-time supply chains and finding the cheapest source globally, that may require some sort of a rethink, pushed along also by some kind of industrial policy in that direction, probably will be taking place. How much remains to be seen. I mean, we thought last time we had the global financial crisis, there would be a change, but things went back to where they were pretty quickly. The other thing I think is that the role of the state we may now be much more accepting of the role of the state in our personal lives. And of course, there might be some huge advantages also, like this meeting we're having. We wouldn't have thought of this meeting the way we are having it in such an efficient manner without any major CO2 emissions by bringing everybody together. But I think one thing that is quite clear is that we are in this reset, the vulnerabilities that the crisis has exposed have to be addressed. For example, I'm looking at data on the Human Development Index and poverty for Asia for the last, say, 50 years or 40 years, let's say. And, in Asia, we thought we had licked extreme poverty, more or less. I mean, there were still pockets of it, but that now extreme poverty had become more of an African problem rather than an Asian problem. And what this COVID has done is, probably, as I saw a UN wider study that at least more than 100 million people in Asia will fall back into poverty. And probably that's an underestimate. So the crisis has set us back at least 5 years, if not 10 years. Rethinking is needed on many lines. And the opportunity is there, but my worry is that a year or two down the line, once a vaccine is found and a cure is sort of more or less on the horizon, then business will go back to normal, and we will go back to the way we were, and military expenditures will rise. Of course, we will live in a more protectionist world, but that tendency was there in any case. Let me stop here, Pradeep, and just throwing out some thoughts of what I've been working on.
Thank you, Ajay. Ajay mentioned FICCI. FICCI is the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, with who Ajay was associated. He's been with the UNDP and World Bank in the past, so I thought the kind of global perspective he could bring was very valuable. With that, may I now turn to Teresa. Teresa, are you there?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Pradeep, for the invitation. I'm also speaking in a personal capacity. And thank you to all the speakers for such interesting thoughts and suggestions. Of course, I agree with Fred Jenny's conclusions. And I think previous speakers have made excellent points. So I would just like to highlight a couple of ideas. First, the fact that we saw different and often not uncoordinated national reactions, even within the European Union, believe it or not. I think it is clear that the global nature of the pandemic really provides an excellent occasion to rethink, to redo, and to relaunch international action and international cooperation. So, of course, coming from the UN, this is what could you expect? But in any case, this does not happen by accident. Like markets don't correct failures automatically. So there needs to be a very strong commitment and very strong engagement at several levels. I think in any case, what the paper and previous speakers have really highlighted, what I think is a little bit the misunderstanding, the misperception between competition authorities at national level and governments, and also, let's say, a complex, sometimes tense, and again, misunderstood relation between competition authorities and other authorities, such as sector-specific regulators and such as consumer protection authorities. So we saw that the quickest reactions to the COVID-19 crisis were actually more related to consumer protection legislation than to competition law and policy, as others have underlined. And I think that this may have been a little bit confusing, but at the same time, as Eleanor Fox mentioned, I think it was a very good moment also for competition authorities to really replace themselves, and why not, again, explore fully the advocacy that, as Alan Fels mentioned, is clearly missing. I would say, on the basis of both parties' responsibilities. So I think governments, and I can think of my own government when in Portugal the first independent competition authority was created in 2003. This idea that you sort of transfer all responsibilities regarding competition, not only law enforcement, but also policy, to an independent body, as if the government did not have to deal with this, as if it was not the government's responsibility to deal with also pro-competitive public policy, especially of economic nature. So this creates a sort of misunderstanding where then competition authorities, because of the need to assert their independence, tend to be a little bit isolated and disregarding or ignoring even what happens in the rest of the public administration. But so there is room for improvement here. I'm also thankful for Eleanor for having said that, of course, OECD and UNCTAD, I think we are well placed to try to bridge the gaps and bring these communities together. Another point that I wanted to make, of course, regards the state aid packages, a great opportunity for competition authorities, but to be actively involved since the beginning in order to promote sustainable long-term development objectives, and again, and a green recovery, and a green and a blue and environmental friendly recovery. This is also an excellent opportunity. I know that the prospects are very dim, but I wanted to draw your attention to UNCTAD's World Investment Report that was released this week, and that also points that there are opportunities for diversification. Of course, again, public policies will be needed. My final point would, with regard the digitalization and the issues that Fred mentioned, the trade-offs that were needed when we talk about AI applications and data protection. I think the trade-off is still far from clear. We have all seen that data protection concerns have spread across the world, well, before the pandemic outbreak, of course. A lot of developing countries, I think, for instance, of Brazil, adopted legislation that is still not enforced, that has been postponed. And a survey that UNCTAD does every 2 years with CG Ipsos really underlines that across the world, consumer citizens are increasingly concerned with this. Now, how can we protect data while encouraging the use of online platforms when that is helpful and provides valuable goods and services, namely to the developing world, still remains to be further discussed, but this would be my points. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Teresa. Just to tell you that state aid is an issue which is mainly dealt with by the EU competition regime, and it is not an important issue. On the contrary, if you look at the kind of post-pandemic situation or pandemic situation, state aid is going to be a part of the resilience package, which you cannot ignore. And that one has to deal with that in a very sensitive manner. May I now request Shumit Majumdar, SKM.
Right, thank you very much. Actually, while this is an absolutely interesting, superb conversation going on, and I've actually managed to make some points on a PPT, one sheet. How do I load it? It'll actually...
Can you vocalize it?
I can vocalize it.
Yeah, please. Thank you.
In fact, that's not a big deal at all. You know? But I think one of the points that actually comes out is that I think from Frederick Jenny's point and a lot of the others is that you have this Frederick List type of economic nationalism back again in the last 5 to 10 years. And that's actually been sort of, been the experience of many countries. I won't name them because I happen to be sitting in one at the moment. But the point is that this has happened in the context of a world which is completely connected globally every microsecond of the day. And we are having this conversation because of that technological feature. Now, one of the things that goes back to that literature, and I want to essentially specifically address issues that Professor Jenny's paper has raised, rather than sort of go into other areas also, is that it is the role of industrial strategy which is important. And I'm using the word industrial strategy as opposed to policy, And I think within industrial strategy, you have three broad sort of arenas of play. And one is essentially to deal with the sort of competitive process, which is, antitrust laws, rules, regulations, etc., making the marketplace the sort of, the mechanism for exchange of goods and services and so on. But the second important issue is within an industrial strategy, there is the ultimate role of capabilities development, which I've also sort of stressed in an earlier sort of chat on the sort of forum. The third issue is really in this context, the role of corporate engagement. And so industrial strategy has these three main parts. One is the the competitive process. Second is capabilities development and corporate engagement, which is all about state aid and the role of the public sector firms and state-owned firms and so on. But here, I think almost every one of you has raised, without saying it in so many words, the fundamental issue which Pradeep vocalized, the notion of livelihoods versus lives and what comes first, you see. And this is where I just want to sort of stress a little bit in terms of the public health national infrastructure, because countries that have had, I think it's important to see whether we have a public health national infrastructure, because having a public health national infrastructure simply goes to the heart of essentially the sort of, the capabilities development part of an industrial strategy, basically, and that itself makes a country rich and powerful, because if you have good, strong, well-nourished people who are not dying but like flies, which is really a question of essentially the role of lives, as opposed to simply articulating a framework for creating the market for jobs, which is the competitive process, which is the livelihoods argument. Now, in my view, there is no distinction between lives and livelihoods. All are important, all are equally important. And I think what is critical is to actually address the issue of essentially creating a national infrastructure, but the national infrastructure costs money. And this is where, so who pays for this national infrastructure? Because if you are going to recreate a national health infrastructure in America along the lines of what was done in Britain in 1945, it is going to cost a few $1 trillion. So where is the sort of trade-off between putting in a $2 to $3 trillion sort of boost package for the economy versus investing that same money or similar quantities of money in a national health infrastructure? And I want to simply in this, because nobody has brought it up, talk about the financing dimension of everything. And here I'm going to digress a little bit, because one critical issue that has emerged in the last 10 years, but has actually become very critical in the last 3 to 4 years, at least in the literature and in the sort of, the public press, is thanks to globalization in part, there has been an enormous concentration in the market for capital. And it is not just enormous concentration in the market for debt capital, for equity capital, because now this is a crisis, which is the crisis which is not being talked about, essentially, the role of concentration in the market for equity ownership of shares. See, and this itself has an impact on, are these sort of sums that you're going to be required for sort of for creating a national infrastructure going to come from the government, or are they going to come from other private sources? Now, where are the private sources? The private sources are really 3 or 4 players, and you have now concentration in the market for corporate capital. You have 3 or 4 major players, such as let me name them: Fidelity, Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street, and maybe to some extent sort of Warren Buffett. They control 70% of the shares in the American stock market. So the concentration issue has hit not just the product markets in America, and I'm basing myself on American evidence at the moment. The evidence from the other countries are relatively few, and this is an issue which has not yet really sort of, made much noise in other places other than America. Is product markets and services markets are totally concentrated. So are labor markets, because these are employers. So you have a concentration of products and services markets, you have concentration of labor markets, and capital markets are completely concentrated. So America and other economies which follow the Washington consensus model, or if you wish, an Anglo-Saxon centric sort of economic governance model, such as India, America, Australia, and the United States are facing a triple whammy of a three-way concentration. And this is actually possibly at the source of some of the discords. I'm raising the issue of money because yesterday I read an article in the News Guardian. Some 72-year-old went into hospital for the COVID problem. And because he was in the hospital for something like 12 days or some 15 days, I forget the number of days, you can read it in Guardian, he was landed a bill of $1.1 million. Now, that is the reality of how COVID is being handled in America. It is not just price gouging, it is price gouging on an industrial scale, on a mega scale. And I want to bring this up because this is, fortunately, nobody's ever brought it up, so I can bring it up. Now, the question is, how do you handle industrial mass scale price gouging at the risk of 120,000 lives or something that America has sort of, shown as sort of the evidence in the last few months. Now, which brings back the issue of how do you raise the sort of, how do you sort of actually solve this triple whammy? I mean, how much of my time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So the triple whammy, and I'm going to suggest that one thing is that regulation may be anathema, but it is maybe, I'm only ending this one theme. Regulation may be anathema because of intervention and sort of, being micromanaging and being the proverbial sort of mother-in-law problem or whatever it is, but we may need to think or rethink the models of regulation because antitrust, and all of the evidence shows, antitrust has not been efficacious, to use Professor Jenny's words. And so therefore, we may need to think of regulatory models as a part of the broader industrial strategy. I have a few more comments, but let me leave it here.
Thank you very much, Shumit. Now, when you talked in terms of that somebody getting a bill of $101.1 million, Nitin Desai had raised this particular issue in terms of the problem that even in India, we're having the same problem in terms of private health. Somebody's been getting bills of 1 lakh rupees for just one day's entry and so on. Now, the more important point, what you have raised is that of human capital. And that you did not define it as such, but I think that is very important. That again, Nitin spoke about the kind of problem that we have in India in terms of the huge migrant labor moving up and down and so on and so forth. But with that, let me now turn to Murray. Grant Murray, please. Sorry to keep you waiting, but you're the...
Hey, no problem at all. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I am a competition lawyer for Baker McKenzie. I don't work for any clients. My role is very much focused on policy and what's happening around the world, spotting trends. So I know many of you from ICN, OECD, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. So I wanted to make a couple of comments on Fred's fantastic paper and a couple of points that have come out from this discussion. And then I think my main observation is in relation to globalization and the world game, as Eleanor put it, which I quite like. But sort of, I think Fred, in a couple of places in his paper, talks about the global financial crisis. And for me, that was a natural reference point with this when I was thinking about competition law. And I have to say that I was originally a little more optimistic, because it seemed that whilst COVID was obviously about contagious things, it wasn't about contagion, which was what we saw with the financial crisis in the financial sector. So I felt like maybe things would be different, but as Fred says, the difference with the financial crisis was that people kept on working. And so we have seen a difference there. And I think that the competition authorities also evolved slightly in tandem with that approach. At first, I saw authorities very quick to say, well, actually, it's business as usual from a competition perspective. We can rely on competition to do various things, and we're not going to relax it. And very, very quickly, I think it was unprecedented how quickly a trickle became a flood of competition authorities around the world saying appreciating that competition was not going to solve things here. And as Fred says, the issue became not so much about price or choice, but about just getting hold of the product in the first place. So I've been very impressed, actually, also with the honesty, I would say, of many authorities in saying what they will allow to get through and some transparency on that. But let me come back to that point. I think Fred also talked about the political science trade-off, and the UK wasn't mentioned in his list, but I think you could include it there. I think it's inherent in politics that we'll see political decisions dressed up as scientific. That's the sad reality. But I think we're also seeing scientific decisions being, in fact, more political than scientific. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think some transparency around who and what making these decisions is important. We've seen a degree of secrecy in the UK in that area. So on to globalization. Is it over? Is it under attack? I hope and believe that it is not the end of it. I think that diversification, as Fred pointed out, is the direction of travel. So I think many, thinking about the clients that I've been talking to, I think that many, what they thought was a global supply chain turned out, in fact, to be a Chinese supply chain. And so I think the development is to think about diversification. China +1 procurement policy is being talked about. We've seen a lot of trends being accelerated by the pandemic. People are bringing forward a lot of their forecasts, but moving supply chains around, I'm not so sure. We're seeing, I think, some probably quite right reluctance to be too impetuous here in terms of, I was expecting to see quite a lot of vertical integration as companies sought to stabilize supply chains, but I think they are quite rightly watching and waiting to see what happens in countries that who might increase, adopt policies which may impact on the ability to procure. There's also the issue of the cost, of course, of moving production to other countries. It's a difficult time to be taking a risk on tier 2, tier 3 suppliers in other countries. So I'm not sure whether that is this movement of supply chains is something that's going to be accelerated or in fact slowed down by COVID. One thing that we definitely do see is that tech and IT, of course, enabled supply chains to become very, very broad and global. And actually, it's also technological developments that will allow supply chains to become more national with automation, AI, making it possible to produce more efficiently and competitively in the local market. And I've seen clients who are thinking more about how to use that to develop things more to the national taste. Now, the idea that companies will develop things more to the UK taste strikes fear into my heart, actually, although you will know, many of you will know that the favorite dish of the UK is the chicken tikka masala. Now, Fred also talked about the lack of a level playing field, when it comes to low standards. And that struck a chord with me, and I think that one area where we can see companies coming together and achieving things in that regard is private standards. And I wanted to sort of turn to this issue that Teresa, I think, mentioned, which was the building back in a more green way, sustainability. So actually, one way in which we can see great improvements in relation to sustainability is with standards. And I think that perhaps this lack of a level playing field that has been thrown up by COVID is a reminder that standards agreed between companies can actually be a more nimble, flexible way of dealing with problems. So my final thing in 2 minutes, less than that, is what is the read across to sustainability? And I think we come back to this idea of working together. Climate change is the next global emergency. We can't solve it on our own. We can't self-isolate from it. And whilst competition authorities, I think, are very quick to talk about the the fact that competition has delivered static efficiencies and some dynamic efficiencies, I think we have to recognize that period of, certainly in Europe or West, period of high competition enforcement has also coincided with some of the most dramatic impacts on the environment. So I think there is a question mark about whether competition law alone can solve anything here. And my view is much more, as I said in my comments online, is that I think the role of competition law is not so much about driving sustainable outcomes, but necessarily getting out of the way to make sure that things can happen. And that is the parallel with the reaction to COVID. We've seen flexibility. Yes, of course, it's short term and narrow. And you know, I don't want to over-egg the read across here, but we've seen authorities talk and articulate very carefully what is not anti-competitive in this context. We've even seen the UK not just talk about what would fall to be exempted, but what actually they wouldn't enforce against for public interest reasons. And I think that that is something that they didn't need to do. And I think that that could be a blueprint. This idea of what might actually be proportionate in the public interest is actually could be a blueprint for other human crises. We've seen lobbying by industry, and yet competition authorities have held up to that. And we have seen a focus on the vulnerable consumer. We often see competition authorities say when it comes to sustainability that we've got to see benefits arise in the same sectors, or the same consumers must also benefit from whatever is being agreed. But in this context, I think we're seeing quite rightly a focus on vulnerable consumers. So that shows a lateral thinking that I think we can bring to sustainable outcomes too.
Thank you very much, Grant. And it appears that Shyam Khimani has left us. Shyam, are you there? He's gone. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. I'm unmuted. Yes, you're hearing me? Good.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So, I mean, congratulations, Pradeep, on organizing this extremely interesting conversation. And congratulations, Fred, for such an insightful paper. And before I finish, I want to come back to what I think is the single most, for me personally, is the single most important sentence in Fred's very, very insightful paper. But first, I want to respond to the points that have been made by Bill and by Eleanor specifically. And, you know, Bill made the extremely important point that public procurement, the public procurement sector, is a really useful and relevant and practical point of entry for competition agencies and competition scholars into wider debates on industrial policy, trade policy, and so forth. And you know, why is that? Well, I think it's for three main reasons. One, as we all know, public procurement is tremendously vulnerable to collusive tendering practices, bid rigging, and other forms of corruption as well, to the more traditional forms of corruption, such as bribery, outright bribery and malfeasance. So this is one reason. A second reason is that I think the public and other governmental authorities accept that there is a legitimate role for competition agencies and competition policy in the public procurement sector. And that is specifically the prevention of bid rigging and so forth. And that gives competition agencies and people like us, you know, a point of legitimacy to start on. But the third point I want to make concerning public procurement is that to get further in this area, competition agencies and competition scholars need to develop a deeper understanding of public procurement processes themselves. And, you know, they need to go beyond, I mean, any competition official, if you ask about public procurement, will say, well, of course, it's very important to enforce the anti-bid rigging laws, which it certainly is. But, and then if you probe them a little more, the second point they will make is that maybe there's too much transparency in public procurement markets because this facilitates collusion, which it certainly can. But the competition, but what would be the ingredients of a broader understanding of public procurement policy issues? And by the way, I think this is a tremendously relevant area for CUTS itself, Pradeep and Uday. And I know that CUTS has done a lot of good work in this area, but it may be time to sort of revive and carry that work further. As competition agencies need to become aware, for example, that there's a whole host of questions about what are the best techniques for procuring and in terms of fostering competition. Is it traditional sealed bid procurement? What is the way to tailor technical specifications so as to maximize rather than minimize possibilities for competition? And concerning the trade-offs with transparency, and I would say all of us around this table know that there can be trade-offs with transparency and competition. Yet we need to remember that transparency rules exist for rather an important reason, which is to prevent potentially even worse forms of corruption than bid rigging, like outright stealing of public funds by the officials involved. And I don't think that's an imaginary problem in many of our countries. So the point, Bill's point, I take to be, and I overwhelmingly support this, that public procurement is a great area and a very fruitful and important area for all of us to be thinking about, for competition agencies to work on and pursue, and I would add for organizations like CUTS to build, to delve into and sort of bring this broader perspective, which recognizes, the tremendous importance of anti-collusion and competition law enforcement, but also takes a broader view of these things. Now, and I'm conscious my time is limited, Eleanor asked, and I love this, and I think it's tremendously relevant. She asked, among many other interesting things, she said, have we lost the WTO? And behind that was her point that we're at risk of losing the vision of cosmopolitanism and the vision of collective interests in addressing all of these issues that we're talking about. And before responding in a more nuanced way to Eleanor's point, I want to say, in a way, it's actually kind of insane that in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, countries are looking inward and adopting nationalistic responses when, for heaven's sake, a pandemic is a overwhelming illustration of a problem that countries cannot solve by themselves. I mean, if the US thinks it's going to solve the problem in the US, but South America is there and with an overwhelming COVID-19 crisis, who in their right mind can imagine that countries can really insulate themselves from a pandemic? They can insulate themselves to an extent from economic policies and industrial policies of other countries, but germs don't recognize borders. And so if anything, I think the COVID-19 crisis should be, cries out for a revival of collective responses and collective action. Now, let me just, and please bear with me. So are we losing or have we lost the WTO? I actually think we haven't lost it yet, but we're very close to losing it. And, even before COVID-19 came along, the WTO was under very, very heavy pressure, including very much from the US administration. And many around this virtual table will know that the WTO dispute settlement function has been really to an extent paralyzed by the US refusal to reappoint judges to the WTO appellate body, which is the final arbiter. So, you know, and that was even before COVID-19 came along. Now we have pressures for relocalization and ending dependence on foreign supply chains and so forth. And, you know, so these are going to certainly reinforce and aggravate the pressures that the WTO is under. Now, I say this, I'm conscious that, you know, many even around this table will have many concerns about the WTO and points of frustration, and those are all fair, and I could perhaps add to some of them. But I make a plea that all of us not forget what to me is one of the core lessons of economic history, the economic history of the 1930s depression in particular. And that is that there is a very real possibility that protectionist pressures and the retreat into economic nationalism will prolong and deepen the deep recession or depression that is going to follow from COVID-19, or at least there's a very real possibility that it will. So, you know, the idea of the WTO passing, even if you have major concerns about the WTO and would like to see it reformed and revamped in profound ways, as I would, it's not something any of us should view with equanimity. Thank you. I could go on, but I won't.
No. I'm afraid, Rob, we have overshot by about 15 minutes, but I suppose that is something which is doable. Indeed, what you rightly pointed out in terms of pandemic, it's a global situation like climate is. And you see what has been happening, and what I've been able to understand is that increasingly there are strong men who are getting elected. And strong men who are getting elected around the world is because of the reason that globalization has led to kind of a lot of discontent in whatever way. Whether it was Trump coming into the US on the basis of, you know, what kind of votes she got, or Modi coming here, or Duterte in Philippines, or Bolsonaro in Brazil, etc. There is a common factor which is driving across, that globalization did lead to a lot of losses, job losses, or too many losers as against winners. And therefore, we have to look at these issues in terms of its political context also, without which we will not be able to deal with the economics of the kind of situation. And therefore, as a consequence, you will find economic nationalism which is increasing, whether it's in the US or India or whichever country you can talk about. Now, with that, by the way, Rob.
Yes. If you allow me 30 seconds, I would like to say two more things. So one is that in defending the role of competition policy, and for me also very much the international trading system, we have to learn to talk the language of fairness and distribution, as Eleanor and Bill and others have mentioned, okay? Most human beings don't understand what economic efficiency is. And so we really have to come back to and remind people, you know, what is a collective action problem and how we can all be better off mutually.
Thank you, Rob, that was a minute. Now, if you remember, there was a paper which I and Taimur wrote after we ran a debate about, you know, competition and equity. You remember that paper?
I do.
You do? Well,
I do.
go
you
back
were making
to,
a point. And that was a good contribution. I remember it well.
Elena had a big say in that particular paper wrote after the debate which we ran. Now, Rob, just for your information, we're also running a series of global webinars on what the world would be without WTO.
Good.
We're writing a paper on that also. So I'll send you the dates. We'll circulate that also to this group. And with that, I would like to now hand over to Fred for the last word.
Well, the last word is a word of thanks to all of you for being here and discussing those issues. I thought it was very interesting. I would like to make 3 quick points. One of them is on public procurement as being an element of both industrial policy on one hand and competition policy on the other hand, and therefore being the right place to start. And I think that competition authorities are very aware of this. I mean, you may have seen, by the way, that as the EU is designing its industrial policy, particularly vis-a-vis firms that are state-supported, it also is dealing with the possibility of integrating this dimension in the judgment on public procurement. So all this is very, very much linked. So I couldn't agree more on the fact that it's quite important. And we actually at OECD are quite engaged on studying public procurement in the wide sense that Rob has mentioned. One thing which is a thought for competition authorities, clearly one of the dimensions of the crisis is the fact that there are time frame within which competition doesn't work fast enough. Okay, so in the very short term, to solve the disadjustment between supply and demand, competition is insufficient because competition takes time and you need to solve the problem immediately. So that raised the issue of what is the right perspective from the time point of view for competition law enforcement and competition policy. We already have this matter in terms of mergers, depending on whether you take a very narrow short time view or a longer time frame. Market definitions are not the same. Potential competition are different. So I think there's a need. I don't think that competition authorities have a systematic view of what is the time frame that they have in mind and what are the limits of competition in different time frames. But this is a very important issue. And finally, something that we have not discussed, but which I think is important. I mean, it was mentioned, but very rapidly. I think there's a collision course between artificial intelligence and competition. And the reason for this is that artificial intelligence is really not so intelligent. It is really treating a mass of data. But the basic point of artificial intelligence is that you do a better job if you have more data than if you have fewer data, whatever the level of the quality of your algorithm. Which means that in order to be effective, and we start seeing this in various fields related to health, whether it's the genome, the exploration of the genome, or whether it's finding a vaccine against COVID-19, that there's a push to have more and more concentration of data, which raises both issues about privacy, but also issues about competition, because whoever has the largest set of data is in the end going to be the winner of that race. So I think that the way the technology is developed is really creating a potential problem for competition that we should think about. Thank you very much.
Fred, the last sentence you made is something which I can wholeheartedly agree with you. As it is said, as we said, data is the new oil. And with that, I would like to thank all of you once again for this patience as well as this participation, this excellent participation that we had, and particularly to those who have left us, except to say that we've recorded this and we'll send you a copy of the recording as well, so you can revisit the debate and see to it. With that, Alan, I hope you've not dropped off by now.
Can't hear you.
1 minute, yeah. Hello,
I am.
Zineni, huh?
I consider I am awake. Yep, no, it's been good. It's been fun. I'm at my best at this hour.
Thank you very much. Well, good day and good night.
Okay.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thanks so much.
Thank you to all.
Bye.
Wonderful.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.